I'm Baron, 22 years old. I'm studying in Yale University, New Haven, majoring in English literature. To be fair, I wasn't a fan of literature, yet I'd managed to drag myself to the last semester of the university. For my graduation thesis, I chose horror short story genre. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with chatGPT. It was a lifesaver for me on every damn test, a miracle like the second coming of Jesus. This graduation thesis of mine was not an exception. I was super confident with chatGPT as my sidekick, so I spent very little time researching for the final thesis. All the time supposed to work on the project, I spent on my new girlfriend Alice's vacation by the seaside. Even after returning from the endless holidays, I spent time partying from dusk to dawn as well. It wasn't until there was 3 days left that I began diving into the graduation project. I woke up around 11 p.m. on that day, followed by a nasty hangover. Groggily, I turned on the laptop. I ran ChatGPT on the background with voice recognition software. "Write me your best horror story," I demanded the artificial intelligence. Suddenly came a creepy laughter that jolted me fully awake. A graduating student night horror story. Damn. Turned out the laughter was all part of the atmosphere. ChatGPT had came a long way, I thought. There was a student named Baron who stayed awake until 11 p.m. to finish on his graduation thesis. People might think he's a hard-working student, but turns out he's marathoning for his laziness. Once again, the laughter echoed from the ChatGPT program. I got a feeling that it was writing about myself. Kinda creepy, but interesting enough to continue further, I thought, watching at the running texts. When he was grinding down on his work for the thesis, Baron felt there was some tingling in the air around him, as if he's being watched. Baron felt a sudden dread prompting him to look around to make sure everything was all right. But then he shrugged, thinking that he's just in a lot of thoughts, and continued his studies. A while later, there came some sudden knocks on his door. Knock, knock. Baron threw his gaze at the door. Who could have come in this late hour? He wondered. The knocking came more and more intense, uneased him. Baron came toward the door, one hand on the doorknob, one eye over the peephole. It was clear that there wasn't anyone outside. The knocking was still there. Baron took a deep breath to calm his racing heart. He decisively opened the door in one fell swoop. Outside was the calm, quiet dormitory's hallway, and the knocking suddenly stopped on its own. It struck a nerve. Baron carefully observed the empty hallway before closing the door and returning to his workstation. Back to his desk, it took him some time before he was able to go back to work. Though there were many things happening, his first priority now was the thesis. Weirdly, Baron's laptop turned the ChatGPT all on its own, even though he wasn't planned to open it. There was some weird text appearing there with only one continuous line of ha 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 ha, together with some creepy laughter. Baron was scared. He tried to turn off the application, but everything wasn't seeming to work. The laughter was louder and louder until he couldn't take it anymore, covering his eyes and ears. And when he reopened his eyes, all Baron could see was his own body twisted and turned over a pool of blood, as if every single bone had been smashed in his body. He yelped aloud, fell down on his back. Together, many objects in his room had been smashed too. The coffee mug was among them. "Superbly done, ChatGPT," I muttered, paused on the text generation. All came to a great start. I started writing down the story into my graduation thesis. As soon as I was typing to the part of the knocking on the door, there was indeed a knocking on the door. My first reaction was to stare down on my laptop. It could be the app's doing. But when I opened the application, everything was normal, no sound coming from there. So there was indeed a knocking on the door, and not something out of the laptop. "Who's there?" I yelled out to the door. Nobody responded. though the knocking kept on going. Curious, I came closer and closer to the door, eyes squinted through the peephole. Weird. There wasn't anyone around, yet the knocking continued. I immediately opened the door and jumped outside. Nobody's there. It was unworldly, similar to the story I had just read. That startled me, so I quickly returned to my work desk and locked the door tight. I tried to remember the other part of the story, which now began taking root and rather scary. So I turned off ChatGPT and continued with my work. However, I couldn't concentrate much. I was on edge, waiting nervously for the next part with the scary laughter. For 10 minutes, there wasn't anything else. I thought to myself it was all my imagination and overthinking, and decided to continue my work. I opened ChatGPT to continue with the thesis. The moment the screen came up, it was me in there, twisted and turned on a pool of blood, as if all the bones had been forcefully extracted from within. The image startled me and I fell backward from my seat. My knees hit hard on the desk, prompting the coffee mug to fall down, breaking into pieces. The hot coffee popped hard and burned my leg. Okay, it wasn't a dream anymore. Okay, everything did feel outworldly strange now. I quickly grabbed my phone to call my friend staying downstairs. Suddenly, the creepy laughter echoed from the ChatGPT program. What do you think about the previous session? Do you wish to continue? I stopped right there, frozen in my desk. A bitter lump rose upon my throat. The fucking apps acted like it knew everything I was doing now. It's as if something sinister was there, trying to get to my nerve. Even though I did not say anything, the application acted as if it had received the command and continued writing. Baron was scared. Everything around him felt weirdly scary. He stared down onto the display without acknowledging a mysterious character in the same room staring into him reading the horror story. Another laughter came, this time accompanied by a creepy tune with it. I jumped into the laptop to close down the screen. The moment I finished doing it, far in the corner of my eyes, over the dark side of the room, I saw a black shadow attentively staring into me. My name's Francis. I'm 30 years old. 5 years ago, me and my best friend Jeffrey, who shared with me the passion for mountain climbing and adventure, especially the discovery of new and untouched lands, decided that we're going on an adventure together. We're planning to go on a climb to Long Peaks, Colorado. We're planning to go there, and so we're preparing for the trip by arranging our work schedules. After that, we'll be climbing many mountains together for quite some time. The time it normally took for a summit wasn't fixed. There's a lot of variations like weather, terrains, and our own acclimatization. With everything prepped and ready, we're heading to our destination with very high spirit. According to our research, climbing there often took somewhere between 10 to 12 hours for a long trip up and down Long Peaks. We started our trip early, and at the start, everything was great. At 11 a.m., we're holding out at a rather flat ground to rest and lunch. Jeffrey was planning to have a long break. He wanted to go around for some photographing. Jeffrey was an avid animal lover. He even had an album with him and the wild animals on his treks before. We're still ahead of time, so I gave him the green light. Jeffrey grabbed his camera and started walking around the site. I decided to get a quick rest right there where we stood. The shades from the trees, the smell of fresh grass and earth. I truly loved this place. The sound of the camera snapping pictures echoed more and more quiet in volume now. He must be rather far away now. I did not remember for how long, but when I was dozing off, Jeffrey came to wake me up. He was very excited with the pictures he'd taken, the uniquely picturesque, as he quoted it. The one stood out among those was the picture about the squirrel den. Normally, squirrels made their dens on the tree trunks. However, he claimed to have seen a squirrel den on the ground. I take a closer look at the picture. I could see two overly spooked animals huddling inside a den with two symmetrical openings. The den looked creepier the more I looked at it. So to confirm it wasn't something off, I told him to take me there to the den. He did, after a moment of confusion, happily took me there. When I got there, I decided to clear the scene a bit by flicking out the dirt and a few rotten leaves away. So my feeling was indeed correct. It wasn't a squirrel den, but a dried out human skull. We looked at each other, our spores filled with an unspoken dread. Jeffrey took a step back and heard a loud snap on his heels. He froze in his tracks while I approached closer and cleared out the scene for a better look. Another dried out skeleton, lying on the chest, had just been under Jeffrey's boots. After a quick cleanup, we discovered a total of 4 human skeletal remains, 2 adults and 2 children. Their clothes remained rather intact, with a lot of expensive stuff on their bodies. It must be someone really, really rich. I tried calling the police, but there's no reception. Jeffrey was dumbfounded by the discovery. He kept staring at the skeletons. I thought Jeff was on the verge of a panic attack, so I told him to descend first, getting the police to come. However, he refused, telling me to do that first instead. He'd remain here so the police would not get lost. I hesitated at first, but decided it's the better option. When I returned with 3 police officers, Jeffrey was still there in silence, staring at the skeletons. When the officers told us to cooperate and get our statements, I was willing, while Jeffrey, citing the stress of this discovery and the exhaustion of the trek, declined and immediately headed back to the hotel room. After the investigation, the police announced to me that this was a millionaire family living 300 kilometers away from Long Peaks. They were reported missing for 3 years, and the search was, until this discovery, ongoing. According to the expensive outfits on their skeletal bodies, they were not hiking at the time of death. The police, suspecting it to be a homicide, would continue with the investigation further. Our hiking trip was doomed. We headed home the next day, still haunted by the discovery of what had happened. Jeffrey changed after that incident. He was no longer a joyful person anymore. He became a reserved person, his sights sunk into the ground. He became disinterested in his usual activities. Even I couldn't raise it anymore. His collection of living, joyful living animals replaced by the albums of their death poses. Their final expression was often of pain and fear of their deaths. Jeffrey and I became more and more distant, and eventually he told me that he's going to move back to live with his family. I, for many times, tried to contact him and suggesting on visit, yet every single time he declined. I worriedly told his mother to check on his sudden change of mood and personality. His family also took him to therapy, yet even the best psychiatrists failed to notice anything unusual. After 3 months, he disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of violence or robbery. All of his relationships remained amicable. There was no one who could have thought about harming him. Without a trace, without any evidence, the investigation came to a dead end. However, the family remained steadfast that their son would one day return to them, that their son just pulled a Chris McCandless move on them and would one day return from his adventure. Until one day, they decided to do a renovation of his home. During the excavation process, the family found a body buried in the backyard. Needless to say, Jeffrey's mom was devastated. Her hunch told her clearly that it was her son, who's been missing for the last 2 years. The investigation confirmed it was him. The cause of death was asphyxia, due to airway congestion by burying alive. There was no sign of physical impact. Under the hole where he'd been found, they dug up a shovel, but all fingerprints on it were his. His death still haunted me to this day. Was it a supernatural force that drained him out and buried him under? Or was it a vile secret that he'd literally keep to his grave?